Okay, this is Jimmy Jive. You're listening to Motor City Rock Talk. Today, my guest is part of a band that's been around since the late 60s, probably 68. He's a guitarist and vocalist that grew up in the Lansing area and formed a band that played around town, the metro area, Ann Arbor area, with the likes of like the MC5, the Amboy Dukes, Iggy and the Stooges, and probably many more. My guest today is that singer-guitarist, Loren Molinare. How you doing today, buddy?
Hey, Jimmy. Thanks for having me on the Motor City Rock Talk show. Dialing in from Los Angeles, but my heart lies in the Motor City there.
That's awesome. I appreciate it. Anyway, like we were talking before, a little bit before we got cut off, give me a little background on where you were from. You grew up in, like I said, Lansing area, obviously, and how you got into music.
Yeah, as a kid, my mom was from the Deep South, and, she liked guys like in the late 50s, Elvis Presley and Everly Brothers. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of my first music that I really heard. And then I got into the whole Philly kind of roulette record scene with Chubby Checker and songs like The Monster Mash and American Bandstand. But really, it was when the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan, like a million of other kids in America and around the world got swept away, Saved in 64, British Invasion, and I've never looked back, And I really picked up the guitar after, the Kinks and Yardbirds and all that stuff that started happening after the Beatles came out. Actually put my first band together in 6th or 7th grade. That's where I met the first drummer of the Dogs, when we had that band. And then later on, a few years later in high school, we put the Dogs together.
Where would you have been playing? So many of the bands and artists in those times would have been just playing like junior highs and parties and sock hop type, like not sock hop, but were you guys playing out actually at that time, playing bars or playing gigs?
In junior high school, we played a lot of YMCA type gigs, backyard parties. And then, like I said, when I got to high school, and that's when I met Mary Kay, bassist of Dogs. She had moved up to East Lansing. And we started doing fraternity parties at, Central Michigan University in Albion. And then we'd do, Mount Pleasant, the school up there, and different school dances and frat parties. And we were gigging around Lansing. But the thing was that I never had the knack to learn cover songs unless it was a simple Kink song. Mm-hmm. And so early on, I just was forced to write original songs. And then once I started getting exposed to what was going on down in Detroit with, the cool bands like Amboy Dukes, MC5, Stooges, Brownsville Station, they were doing a lot of originals, and, they were obviously being influenced by the bands coming to play the Grandy Ballroom. So we never really played bar gig per se, or where establishments wanted you to be like a top 40 band. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we lied and said, oh, here's a song by so-and-so, and it was just an original just because we wanted to get the gig. But, luckily for us, we met this agent in Detroit, Jerry Patlow, his name was, and he booked a lot of, not like the Grandy Ballroom or stuff like that, but he booked like St. Thomas Aquinas high school dances. And on the weekends in the late 60s, you could have The Who even played there, I think, in 67. Wow. But on a weekend at this Catholic school, MC5, Alice Cooper, Brown, we played there twice, once opening for Brownsville Station, once opening for the Rationals from Ann Arbor. So, but we ventured down to Detroit to do that, and then we'd go back and, we were gigging quite a lot in Lansing at school functions and those frat parties and stuff. It wasn't until we played a show with Dick Wagner and the Frost up in Owasso, Michigan at the Armory. Okay. And Mary had known Dick Wagner back when he had the Bossmen before the Frost. They kind of connected, and it was God bless Dick Wagner, because he brought us down to play our first proper shows in Detroit, where we played the Silver Bell in Pontiac, and we played the Birmingham Palladium opening for the Frost, and it was a mind-blowing experience.
Sure.
Just to be in Detroit playing those venues like in 68, 69, it was like way different than Lansing, Michigan, you know.
Oh,
The
big
Detroit rock scene was always like the kids' hair were longer, everyone looked more like hippies, and it was just pretty intense.
Yeah.
In a great way.
Now, one of the things I was going to ask you too was, being in the late 60s, the bands we'd mentioned, you know, that, you know, were about that time in the Detroit scene, the MC5, the Dukes and all that. I noticed that, at least from the recordings I've heard of you, and maybe there was stuff that you did back then that just isn't out anymore that I haven't heard. A lot of them were doing like, kind of like protesty type of things, which are, you know, there's a lot of college scenes now where they're protesting the Israel, you know, Iraq thing. Were you guys involved in any kind of protest, demonstration kind of concerts or any of that stuff in the 60s?
Yeah, we were. I mean, we would do, you know, like when this, like around Kent Day time, when that happened,
Right.
Students took over MSU campus, just like they did several universities around the U.S. around that same time. We went out and played in the middle of Grand River Avenue. Somebody broke into the department store, Scott Howard, for us, and we played out in the street. We would always play, you know, the normal rallies to legalize weed, you know, especially after John Sinclair had been busted for 2 joints. And, you know, around that time, we wrote songs, John Rock and Roll Sinclair, in 70, 71, and, you know, thought it was pretty unfair that, you know, the cops or the feds took him away for that. So, yeah, if there was always any kind of protest thing, we would be always there, you know, wanting to stand up, using rock and roll as a vehicle to stand up against the Vietnam War or injustices, whatever was going on at the time.
Yeah, because the lyrics to the stuff on the Fed Up album and the last one you put out don't really say that. They're really just kind of like, you know, rock and roll, you know, kind of things and little storylines and stuff. That's why I wondered if at that time some of the stuff you were doing might have been a little bit different. So some of the stuff...
Well, to quote you though, like Fed Up, you know, came out in 77, and that was just feeling alienated from, in general, you know, Slash Your Face was written anti-fascist kind of song, like, you know, to the elitist group who think they're like better than others. We just thought, slash your face, you think you're the master race, you think you're better, you know, because we think everyone's equal. And, you know, so those songs were interpreted as some punk rock things, and they were just more of a social statement to us, you know.
Well, that was the other thing I was going to ask you too about that, is it had been stated somewhere that I read that you were more or less too punk for the rock scene and too rock for the punk scene. Which, in your opinion, do you think you guys lended yourselves more toward punk with a rock edge or rock with a punk edge?
You know, that is a very interesting analogy and question there, because we grew up in the late 60s, influenced by the Detroit rock scene, which was just like kick-ass rock and roll, right? The word punk didn't even come out via the media till like Ramones area of 76.
Exactly.
And we were playing loud and fast in the late 60s and 70s. Now, people like thought it like we were punk, and it did get to the point where, I mean, because a lot of our first shows, we got to open for those great bands in Detroit, like I mentioned. And, you know, so we knew you had to play your instrument properly, and you had to put on a show and be fucking kick ass. When the punk rock scene came out, the whole thing was like, you could be ugly, you could be fat, you didn't have to be good looking, you didn't even have to play good. And it was like the anti-establishment of so-called rock stars, you know. But we did fit into that because we had such an edgy sound coming from Detroit. I mean, we've all read like how the MC5 influences on the New York Dolls, and then ultimately Sex Pistols and the Clash, and the same with the Stooges. So we could play with bands like the Ramones, and we did open for them. We opened for AC/DC, their American debut at the Whiskey in Hollywood. We played with Van Halen, and we played with Ted Nugent, and, you know, we played, so we could kind of bridge the gap. But there was a bit of kickback in LA with the hardcore scene about us, because they kind of looked at us like, you know, like we were like Journey, and we're like a million miles away from Journey.
No,
but
you weren't like that journey.
But when it's all said and done, it's just rock and roll to us. And the music industry and the media, they're always great at labeling stuff.
But put things in a box, right? What I was getting at with that was, I was, because in '68 I was 6 years old. I'm a bit younger than you. I didn't think it was even labeled punk until, like you said, the '70s with the Ramon Flash. In the '60s and all that, it was just music. It was rock music or whatever. Were they actually using the term punk rock in the '60s?
No, I never heard it until John Holstrom or whatever his name is started Punk magazine in New York.
Yeah.
I mean, there was garage rock, the Seeds and Music Machine and a lot of that kind of cool stuff. But even Pushing Too Hard by the Seeds, like I said.
Chandel's Dirty Water. Yeah, it was underground, like you said. It would have been more garage band, in my opinion. Because the same thing happened, I think, with like heavy metal. Black Sabbath was around, Zeppelin, all those bands, but they didn't really come out and call it heavy metal until later, with more or less, the second British invasion with Iron Maiden and Judas Priest and those bands. And I think that was the same with the punk thing. And I wondered, the reason I brought it up is I was wondering if maybe by the time, you guys start out in '68, bump up again to '77, almost into the '80s, the Ramones and some of those other bands. And did you guys maybe get left behind from that because you were part of the old school thing that hadn't quite bridged the gap into the new punk scene?
Yeah, I think a bit, because we played our instrument too well, and we kind of, got kind of considered like old school or old wave to a bit, I mean, we had moved to New York from Detroit because we basically had gotten blackballed for several reasons. Yeah. But moving to New York, pre-punk scene and meeting Kiss before they got signed and Blondie, was quite an experience too. But yeah, things got, you talk about being punk. Well, we always would stand up for the cause of rock and roll. And it started to get to the point where the main booking agency that in Detroit, DMA, that booked Nugent, Bob Seger, MC5 Stooges and all that, ended up telling promoters, if you want the Dogs on the bill, then you're not going to get our band. So because they just thought we were troublemakers. So after some stints that we had pulled off, like playing Toledo Sports Arena, booked with Bob Seger and 3 other local bands down there. And unfortunately, we were set up on stage in front of 9,000 kids, and Bob's road manager came in and said Bob was kind of tired and wanted to go play right now, and you guys can close the show. And we said, we can't do that. He's the headliner. Nobody's going to stay.
Yeah, that's shit.
And we're already set up on stage. We're going to go up and at least play one song. And the promoter came in with, at that point, with the tour manager, road manager, and said, if you guys go on stage, you're going to jail. Luckily, at that point, we had a guy that was like, bands in those days always like attracted investment from guys that moved a lot of hash and weed. One of those guys was with us, and he says, listen, I've got the money to bail you out. You have to stand up to this for the love of rock and roll. So we knew that even if we got arrested, we were going to be okay.
You would have had to have signed, I would think in those days, some kind of contract that said you were to play this and you were the opening act, and they were on it.
Well, there were 5 bands in the bill, and we were 4th, right before Bob Seger. And we were not going to just back down. And we said, we're going to play one song. And they said, if you do, you're going to jail. And we go, yeah, rock and fucking roll. Right. And then we walked on stage. Toledo City cops came on stage with billy clubs. They don't like people from Michigan coming into Ohio raising hell, right? So everybody in the band, a few of our crew, I was the only person that they didn't grab. I don't know why, but yeah. And then everybody got charged felony charges, inciting to riot kind of felony charges.
So you didn't even get to play a song?
No, they pulled the plug on us, and all this happened in front of 9,000 kids. So, I heard that Bob came out, but the mood of the audience was a little kind of strange after watching this band get pelted by the police. But, anyway, the judge threw it out on Monday after that weekend, and, the charges were dropped. But needless to say, if there's a thing in anybody's career, would you change anything, Loren, about your past? This is like, I might say, if you're in a band, watch what you do, because you could, pay the price for it. And so we basically got blackballed and had to move to New York, which was a good advantage to us because we just said, we're going to New York. We had no place to live. We hit the streets of Manhattan, and that was a real wake-up call from naive kids from Michigan hitting the streets of Manhattan with no place to live and no plan. We're going to go make it, you know, Jimmy?
Right. Yeah.
So that was a great thing because we met Kiss, we met Debbie Harry, the Dictators. We ended up playing with television at Kansas City. We bailed our audition at CBGB.
Oh, really? I was going to ask you that because, you know, those bands other than Kiss all typically started out pretty much as CBGB. So you didn't get to play there?
Oh, well, we auditioned, but Hilly thought we played too loud because we had 4 Marshall staff. And so he said we were too loud. But
get the hell out of here. Too loud. So, in other words, in those days, you were louder than, let's say, the Ramones or some of the other bands that he did have play there?
Yeah, we always used our 4 stacks of Marshalls, even in those small New York clubs. I mean, you know, hey, we had to get our tone, you know.
Oh, well, I understand, sure.
It was kind of ridiculous. I mean, if you think about it now, but, you know, when you're late teens, early 20s, you know, you do what you do. But it was a great experience.
Yeah.
Being there in that pre-CBGB's New York punk scene. And the great thing that we learned there was the variety of bands that were in that new wave punk scene that were so different from each other because you had Talking Heads, you had the Ramones, the Dictators, the Dead Boys came there, Television, Kiss, all on the heels of the New York Dolls a few years earlier. And it, you know, you didn't have to be like punk, you could be like Talking Heads. Punk was an attitude, I think.
Right.
So it was really good.
Speaking of Kiss, of course, that's another band that so many people that I've interviewed have all mentioned as inspiration as far as, you know, attitude and going out to the big show and the loud rock. What was your experience with meeting them? In other words, did you play a show with them in a club? Or, I mean, was that actually Kiss? Or was that Wicked Lester that was supposed to be pre-Kiss?
I love you, Jimmy. Wicked Lester. You're quite thorough on your
I'm 63.
No, mind you, this is true. So the day we got to Manhattan, we saw these posts on poles in Manhattan that said this at the Diplomat Hotel. And that was the famous show that Bill Coyne, who ended up being their manager, saw them at. But we went to the Diplomat Hotel, and being naive kids, like I said, from Michigan, we were really green behind the ears. I went up to the ballroom, and that, you know, the bands were doing sound checks, and I realized Kiss was putting on the show. So talked to like Paul Stanley, and I said, hey, my name's Loren from the Dogs. We just got in from Detroit. Can we play tonight? And he goes, look, man, this is New York fucking city. Who do you think you are to think you can come here and play in a Kiss show? Yeah. And I'm thinking, wow, these guys are pretty harsh, or, you know, or I'm pretty naive.
Yeah.
Maybe it's both, right? And he said, listen, if you get a gig and we come and see you, if we think you are cool enough, maybe you can play with Kiss. And we went, fair enough. So we left and found some city park we could crash in that night or whatever. But we ultimately, a few weeks later, got a gig at the Coventry in Long Island City, where the Dolls and that whole glam scene was kind of happening. And they came and seen us, and they said, okay, you have a big ass U-Haul type truck. You go to Amityville and pick up our gear from last week's show that we did out there and take it into Manhattan to our rehearsal studio. We'll let you play with Kiss on a Saturday night here at the Coventry in Long Island City. We said, fair enough. So we went out to pick those guys up in our truck, went out to Amityville, picked their gear up, not really knowing what Kiss looked like, because we did not see them first night in Manhattan. So when we got to Amityville, picked their gear up, Gene or Paul said, oh, look, and one of their fans had Polaroid pictures of Kiss, and I looked at it and went, oh my God, it was like kabuki makeup. And, you know, I was aware of David Bowie and glam and stuff, but this was glam rock on steroids. And so thought, okay, and we dropped their gear off in Manhattan, and we went play with them that Saturday night, and we got to share the dressing room with them, and you'll love this story. In the dressing room, Gene Simmons came up to me, and at that point I had grown a beard because I just started shaving, and growing a beard kind of pissed my parents off. And Gene came up to me and said, "Look, man, the Grateful Dead are fucking dead. This is glitter glam rock. Shave your fucking beard off." Whoa, here we go again. These New York guys are pretty brutal. And it took me until I moved to LA, and I did shave my beard off. But New York was a learning experience, in more ways than one. The city got too intense to live in, and we did come back to Detroit to our house that we had down by Wayne State that we kind of subletted while we went to gallivanting off to New York and stuff. So
right. That's crazy. That gig you're talking about in New York at that hotel, the thing about Kiss, because I'm always, like I said, a big Kiss fan and so many others, was that they decided, instead of like you had said you guys weren't really doing covers. If you had to pretend to do a cover, you would just say it was, a cover of this and it was one of your songs. Kiss came out with the idea of like, to be a rock star, you have to present yourself as a rock star. The persona of like, I'm already made it. I'm already a rock star. And come out and play like you're on top. Is that the impression you more or less got from them? And did that in any way influence your attitude of like, okay, this is how I got to go at it?
Yeah, it was evident that they had a plan and the larger than life thing. I remember in the dressing room, Peter Criss says, "Do you think I like wearing this stuff? We're going to get signed. We're going to make it." I mean, all those guys had the attitude before they were signed that they were already signed and they were already going to be superstars. Right. They were stars then. And I got to give them credit. They stuck to their format, and it really worked. Obviously, Detroit loved them.
Right.
Yeah. I have other Kiss stories later on from the 90s, too.
I was just wondering about that because, like you said, they were being a bit harsh, and you being maybe young and naive, if they had influenced you in that way, or if you got, some kind of wisdom out of that.
Oh, yeah. And I will say this, later on in the 90s when my other band, Little Caesar, had gotten signed, and we went out on the Hot in the Shade tour, opening for Kiss at Nassau Coliseum and the Meadowlands and all over the East Coast and stuff. Gene would be on the side of the stage every night, and he would come into the dressing room, "Stop running around like chickens with your heads cut off. This is the arena. You have to do everything slower. You have to project to the top row, right, way at the back of the Coble Hall or whatever." And he, those guys, nobody tells you what not to do in this industry, but I got to give those guys credit. They were always brutally honest, trying to tell me and both my bands how to get better at doing it,
Right.
So
yeah, if you're playing a big stage like that, don't waste all your energy running around too much, part of you play this side, part of, and mix it up a bit. Yeah, I could totally get that. That would have been some really good advice. Now, the other thing I had noticed and stuff, and one of the songs that was on the album that really, I enjoy them all. They're really killer. I've been listening to the thing ever since Cherry introduced me to you guys, is the song Motor City Fever, where you pretty much, pounce out all the Detroit artists, from Aretha Frank, the Amboy Dukes, to the, all of it. And there's a part in the song where you start playing "I Want to Be Your Dog," and you're like going, Iggy, the Stooges, "I want to be your dog all night long." Did that in any way influence the name or influence the attitude of calling yourself the Dogs?
Yes, amen. And there's a great story why the band is called the Dogs, because of the Stooges. In those early rehearsals, when we first met Mary Kay, when she came up to live in East Lansing, and we met her, she walked down to Art's parent basement to rehearsal with first single on Elektra by the Stooges, "I Want to Be Your Dog." And we played it in that opening feedback of Ron Aston in the key of B, and the whole thing. And I was mesmerized back that "I Want to Be Your Dog," and I said we should call the band the Dog, and Art and Mary agreed. I went and told my mother that, and she was offended. She went, "That's all you think of yourself? You're just a bunch of dogs?" And I went, the light bulbs went on, and I went, man, if my mom is pissed off because we're called the Dogs, this is the right name.
Yes.
And, if you really are a lover and of dogs as pets, we know that dogs are man's best friend.
Right. But they can be vicious too and aggressive. And I think that ties into it too.
Yeah. So unfortunately for us, the name fit. But over the years, we come to realize this band in France were called the Dogs. And there's a band, the Dogs, in Norway. Our manager back in the early 2000s, Mario Escovedo from the band The Dragons, was managing us. And when Facebook came out, and he says, we've got to separate you from these other so-called bands called the Dogs. You guys were like the first ones. So he was the one that came up with our face page, the Dog/Detroit, because he knew we lived in Detroit. It didn't really have the cachet saying the Dog/Lansing. It was the Dog/Detroit. And some people go, well, why do you do that? Well, we needed to clarify, we're from Michigan. We're the Michigan Dogs. It may be Lansing or Detroit, but Motor City always has a ring to it. But you did say something about Motor City Fever. And that song, there's a great video of that song live from 1971 with pictures from the gig at Michigan State University. But obviously I had read too much of Mike Gormley's Free Press articles about every Friday the Motor City rock scene, and I felt like I gotta write a song. I'm burning up with the Motor City Fever, and when we actually recorded it, finally did the recording on the Hypersensitive album in 2012, I thought, what, we got to pay reverence and honor to all those artists in the Motor City that got us going, from Aretha Franklin and Temptations and Marvin Gaye to Brownsville Station to Nugent, Savage Grace, Frog, Indy 5, all that stuff.
That was really cool.
Yeah, and some people go, well, we had bad reviews in LA here, these guys, they never grow. They just try to still continue this Detroit rock scene. Well, that's fine. That's what we like to do. We just kind of stay true to what turned us on to music, and we just wanted to do our thing to continue the rock and roll Detroit rock and roll dream.
And the thing that to me, because I hear that kind of stuff, they talk about that kind of stuff, certain bands, and it just is so annoying, because it's like some of the greatest bands out there that have stood the test of time and and are still out there doing it are all about that in a different way. For example, AC/DC. Every album is basically the same, but they sell out everywhere they go. They sell millions of records, but it's the same kind of music over and over and over again. You could almost say that with a lot of bands, the Ramones did that at the time. Everything was a 2-minute song, but it was successful. That's what made their mark. You got to stay true to it. It's not like the Dogs were all of a sudden go, okay, we're the disco Dogs, and start doing funk music. No, you've got to stay true to what you are, and that to me is really cool, because so many artists have not done that. Have gone off, even the latest, I'm not a big fan. Kid Rock, out of Detroit, got his big, big push and whatnot. All of a sudden he thinks he's a country artist, No, rock stage, he's not a kid anymore, he's 50, but it's, this is what you were all about. This is what made you. I know as an artist you want to grow somewhat, and want to do this, but don't get too far out there, because you're going to alienate the audience that, that grew up with you.
Yeah, well, Mary Kay, the girl from Lincoln Park plays she's like the monitor of us staying true to our roots. She'll say to me, it's like, how Mick and Keith kind of go back and forth, because they're so passionate about the songs, and you hear stories of Keith wants to put a knife up to Mick's throat. Mary's like, we have an obligation. We have to do what we always have done,
Yes.
And you write new songs and say new things, but, we're not going to be writing songs about falling in love too much or stuff like that.
Ballads.
It's more of a, kind of a social conscious kind
Sure.
of vibe, you know, and don't want to be overly political, but we live in a political world, but it's more, I don't look at it as politics. I look at it as issues of more social relevance. And that can be a wide scope of subject matter if you look at it like that, you know.
Now, as far as the band back in the day and going on through the entire period, were there very many bands at that time or going into today that were basically a three-piece power trio like you guys, power punk, power rock, whatever you want to call it, that had a female bass player? I mean, did that open doors? Did that cause any issues as far as that? I mean, basing this on the fact that rock and roll and music in general is a male-oriented field and stuff, has been, you know, as far as corporate and all that. Did that have any effect on you guys at all over the years?
Early on, to have a female bassist, I mean, years before Chrissie Hynde fronting the Pretenders or Susie Quattro moving to England and really having her thing explode. But early on, it was, people didn't get it and were kind of like almost offended. Like, you know, we're a trio. You've got, you know, this 19-year-old bass player. Why we're like, you know, Art and myself was like, you know, 15, 16, you know, Mary is like 4 or 5 years older than us. And people didn't get it because she played like Jack Bruce and Cream meets James Jamerson playing Motown music. So, you know, she, unfortunately, I don't think she's got credit given to her for breaking down a lot of barriers and being as accomplished musician as she really is, you know. So, you know, she just keeps trudging that happy road, you know, either, you know, you're the hare or the tortoise, and she's just the tortoise, just continues straight forward, you know.
It was kind of common for a while, like you had mentioned, Chrissie Hynde, and you put Joan Jett in there too. But these were artists that fronted the band. You know, they were the front of it. The female rockers that brought it. She wasn't. You know, she was part of the band, but she wasn't the front person. You know that. You know, so that had to be, you know, a little bit different as far as that. Especially like you said, her being older than you. But at the same time, it had to help you guys because, from what I've heard, she's an incredible musician, and she her chops are still there. Does she sing anything with your shows or anything as far as a lead, or is she just strictly back up?
Just back up.
Is that by choice, or she doesn't feel comfortable singing lead, or? You
know what? For dog songs, she's always just, you know, sang background. I think it would be fantastic if she did sing a song, you know. It's good subject matter to consider for the future.
Okay, so you leave New York, you come back to Detroit.
So we come back to Detroit. We had our manager, Bill Sheets, who was a Detroit school teacher that we had met at River Rouge Park a few years before. But he had booked a tour for us down into Tennessee, Georgia, Florida for spring break. The big gig was Daytona Beach, 1975, Easter Sunday. And so we left on tour. It didn't go too well because disco was very big in 1975. We were starting to get fired from booking in Nashville, Orlando, a few other cities because we were playing too loud and too fast. You know?
Can't dance to it, right?
No, can't dance to it. And in Orlando, after we got fired, Ron Wood, the drummer, quit. He got disillusioned, and I can't blame him. He was going to go back to Michigan. We said, screw that. We're going to Hollywood. We got to just go to Hollywood. So Mary, myself, and the roadies barely got to Hollywood. So the band basically broke up there in Florida. At the same time, the New York Dolls had went down there around that same time on their Red Hat and Leather tour. That didn't go too well with them either, and they broke up after that. But yeah, we ventured out to LA in April of 75, got established out here. We were living in the streets for a bit. Ron did come back out about 8 months later, and then, you know, we were rocking quite hard out here. We helped kind of be involved in this band coalition called Radio Free Hollywood, with an early version of the Motels and this band The Pop, because original band couldn't get bookings at the Whiskey or the Starwood, so we started putting on our own shows and kind of, you know, DIY underground kind of stuff that kind of got to the point where the Whiskey and the Starwood started booking they were calling it new wave indie original bands. And you know, like our first show at the Starwood was opening for Van Halen and Quiet Riot at the Starwood. Yeah, it was pretty intense, you know, seeing Van Halen for the first time.
Were those bands signed at that time? time, or were they?
No, they were not. Van Halen had not been signed. We ended up playing with Van Halen several times, and their audience was the top audience to open for because, you know, they were dedicated Van Halen fans. We played with them when they headlined Pasadena Civic. After they got signed, we played with them at the Whiskey. We played with them quite a few times. They really tried to help us with their manager. That's how we got to play with open for AC/DC. They helped us get that gig. Yeah, you know, it was
Wild about that too is coming like almost full circle as far as that, because Van Halen was discovered, of course, by Gene Simmons, Kiss, who you guys had done some stuff with back in New York. And did they know anything about that? Did they know anything as far as the connection that you guys had played with Kiss? And were Van Halen at that time when you were playing with them at those places? Because I know they started out doing a lot of covers, and you had mentioned that a lot of original bands couldn't get gigs at the Whiskey. Although, from what I understood in the 60s, obviously before this, I mean, the Doors played there. They had, you know, original bands there. How did that change to where all of a sudden, you know, they wanted bands that were going to be doing covers?
Well, yes, Van Halen could play 4 sets of cover songs, and they worked 5-6 nights a week.
Mm-hmm.
That's why they got to where they got. They loved freaking play. And there was a place on Sunset Strip called Guitarist where a lot of those bands play, and they would be cover bands. At the same time, Van Halen had all original too, you know. So when the Starwood opened up, that's when they started doing their original set. And you know, I never did chat with them about our New York days, knowing Kiss or whatever. And, you know, ultimately it was Ted Templeton who had came down from Warner Brothers that signed them.
Right.
But I know Gene did do demos with them, and I think that did help pushing along to build the awareness that Warner Brothers.
Well, that's the story anyway. Like I said, I don't know if it's true, but that's the story that, you know, that Simmons more or less said he discovered them at demos and passed them on, and of course Ted Templeton did the rest. So as far as you being in LA and you're doing this and you're starting to reestablish yourself out there, what happened to the point where you decided at some point to, I don't know, put it as a side thing for a while and start this band or join this band Little Caesar? How did that come about?
Yeah, well, so we're building it up in LA, 75, 76, 77, 78, and everything's going great. And then all of a sudden, there seemed to be a backlash by the hardcore scene, and the gigs were becoming less and less. We had a friend that was an agent that was a British guy that said, hey, you need to come to England and book the tour. So that's when we put together our EP, 3-song vinyl, 7-inch Slash Your Face, and we sold everything we had and moved to London in like November of 78, and we went there to live. It was kind of like Spinal Tap. As soon as we got there, management, the money guy, pulled out. We ended up living on the street, squatting in London in January. We did do some cool gigs around England and Ireland, and never went to Scotland. It got really rough squatting in London in the wintertime when we came back to Detroit, and that's when we moved to LA. Fast forward, we went back to Detroit after England, then came back to LA, and then we got really disillusioned with who we were because we had went from Detroit to New York, LA to London, and never got a major record deal. And we kind of lost sight, Jimmy, of who we were and gave up on the dream. We tried to change the band and get a female singer in for a bit, change the name to Attack, and we kind of lost our way for a bit. Mid-80s, I said, we're going to be the Dogs again. I'm fronting it. We had some major label interest in 87, 88 from Atlantic Records. Some friends of mine were starting that band Little Caesar. I kind of joined it to just stay busy.
Right.
And before you knew it, we had an offer and got signed for over $1 million to Skepta. At that point, everybody had passed label-wise on the Dogs, so it kind of decided just to put that on the back burner, why I did the Little Caesar thing. Luckily for us, the fans in Europe and Japan was building because bootleggers, really, if you want to know why the Dogs this day, bootleggers had bootleg Slash Face on the Killed by Death series in the mid-90s, early 90s, and unbeknownst to us, this whole underground thing was starting to happen in interest in the Dogs. In 2000, Lee Joseph from Dionysus Dionysus Records contacted me and said, hey, I want to do a best of called Fed Up of the Dog. And so we kind of put it back together then because realized that, you know, we gave up on the dream, but the dream didn't give up on us. And so we put it back together and we put a second album out. Ron Wood came back, like I said, and did that on Dionysus. And at the same time, there was interest in Japan. And there's a guy from Detroit named Troy Jack. He's from Grosse Pointe area, but he's a total record collector. He had moved to Tokyo to teach English to young Japanese kids. And he contacted me and he wanted to put out Dog's tribute album in Japan with all these Japanese bands playing dog songs. And I thought, yeah, right, whatever. And it took a few years to get going, but in 2007, the Dog's tribute came out and he brought us to Tokyo and we did our first tour of Japan, playing with all those bands from Tokyo and D4 from New Zealand. And
jeez, that must have been cool.
Yeah, so, and then he brought us back in 2012 and we did a second tour. So Ron Wood from Lansing couldn't go to Japan because he had some legal problems because of a divorce and getting a passport. And, you know, rearage, you know what rearage is, alimony stuff. And so that's when Tony Matucci came back in the band to go to Japan with us and stayed with us until 2023. So in a roundabout way, I kind of covered a lot of ground quickly for you.
Now, with this tribute album with these bands, were they all doing your songs in Japanese? Were they singing in Japanese?
Well, you know, the thing about the Japanese culture, they a lot of people do speak English. They sang in
broken English, yeah.
Broken English, and you know, rockabilly bands. Jackie and the Seekers did a rockabilly version of Rebel Rock. The Go-Go Girls sang Class in 1970, and you know, D4 from New Zealand did John Rock and Roll Sinclair and I think Sleeve City. So yeah, it was a real honor to meet all those bands when we went there to play. So,
that had to really kind of be kind of like heartwarming and uplifting too, to say, oh man, we thought we didn't have much of an impact. Even if it was around the world, it didn't matter. You made your mark. You know, not everybody does that.
Yeah, and fortunately for us, in Japan, like in the UK and Europe, they are diehard fans of Motor City Rock. I mean, when we went to Tokyo, we met all these young garage rock guys with buttons, Stooges buttons, MC5 buttons on their jackets, and we thought we had died and went to heaven. And, you know, you have your Motor City Rock Talk show. Well, the influence of Motor City music around the world is just amazing, you know, and it was really clearly evident how important the Motor City sound is when we got to travel outside the U.S. and really see how passionate the fans are for anything Detroit, really. I mean, I know Nikki Corvette from Detroit. She goes to Tokyo. She wasn't there too long ago. I think she was there. You know, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and it was really cool, like you say, on the Motor City Fever thing, that, you know, you weren't just talking about rock bands. You mentioned, like I said, even the Motown thing, the R&B, which, like you said, is huge around the world. It never died off. You know, it's still loved to this day everywhere, and that music has influenced so many different artists, pop to rock and whatever, even country. So yeah, that was a real fitting and a cool tribute to that. Okay, as far as the band, you guys are now obviously relocated or stationed more or less in California, I imagine. What, if any, is in the future? I mean, your last out, you've got a few singles that you've put out in the last couple of years. Is there anything beyond that, and a couple of videos I meant that I've seen also? Anything as far as new albums, as far as recordings?
Yeah, so here's what's in the near future. We're going to have a career retrospective CD coming out September 1st on Rumbar Record from Boston, and we're going to have 2 new songs on that, an unreleased version of a cover song by Eddie and the Hot Rods. We've got Do Anything You Want to Do, and then we have a brand new song that we just recorded with our new drummer Rob Fennell that's going to be included on that, a song called Secret Place, and this is coming out we're going to be playing October 17th in Lansing at Grey Wall Hall, and then the next night, Friday night, October 18th, we're playing the Lager House in downtown Detroit. It's a great Detroit show because we have the Strains on the show, which to me, they're like a modern day version of Sunday to Rendezvous. They kick
Oh, absolutely.
ass.
Yes.
I love them. And then Ricky Rat's band East Side Alive are opening the show. So it's an amazing bill that we got.
Ricky Rat's amazing. He's been doing it nonstop from, in the mid 80s. He had a band called the Mystery Girls that turned into the Trash Brats. Very entertaining. He's one of the guys I've had on my show. Love Ricky. He's great. All right, Loren, I'm going to let you go. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today. I look forward to those shows. I'm going to try and make more of them. But if not, I'll definitely be at the Logger House because that's a little bit closer to my turf.
Jimmy, thank you for having me on the Motor City Rock Talk. I appreciate it. Look forward to meeting you October 18th at the Logger House.
Yes, absolutely. All right, man. Say hello to the band and, keep the faith. Keep doing what you're doing, man, because it's really good and it needs to continue. You guys are an inspiration to a lot of people that may come up against hard times as far as music or life in general and want to give up. And to me, a group like yours that's persevered over the years and is still doing it, man. Like I said, I'm 63. I'm younger than you are, and I'm not lugging equipment around anymore like the old days, even though it's smaller.
Yeah.
So kudos to you, man, and your band. I know you have a crew to help you, but, that you're still out doing it, it's great. I really look forward to meeting you in person and stuff and seeing the show.
You got it, Jimmy. Thank you so much. Take care. Till I see you soon.
All right, take care. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All right, that was Loren from the Dogs, band that started out here in the late 60s, played the scene, the Detroit metro scene, with the likes of, like you mentioned, the MC5, the Amboy Dukes, the Rationals, Brownsville Station. Had some issues being blackballed and all that, which is a shame. Went out to New York, made some contacts there, played with Kiss, played some other stuff, went to Europe and played over in London, ended up back in Detroit, went to LA. He's been all around the hemisphere. And just the fact, like I was mentioning, that they're still at it. They're still keeping it real, sticking to their guns, sticking to what they know and love to play, to me is like incredible. It's an inspiration to me to continue doing interviews like this with these kind of people, these acts, because it's just incredible to me. Anyway, with that said, if you like these interviews, and I'm hoping you do, I'm going to have quite a bit more in the future. And just leave a like if you can, and maybe a comment about the interview, a suggestion or whatever. And if you haven't already, maybe hit that subscribe button. It doesn't cost anything, and it just shows me that there's still interest in what I'm doing. Anyway, with that being said, and as I always like to say, keep rocking.